the title is tough. And the Middle Eastern minorities in a changing world. Always the victim with a question mark. I have to tell you something, that as I was preparing the talk, it was one of the most difficult talks I've ever had, I've ever prepared. For a simple reason. It made me enormously uncomfortable. And it challenged me more than I could expect. I didn't expect that it would be so personal to me. And I felt, as I was researching and I was putting my own experience in the talk, I felt a lot of us would be somehow, in some parts of the talk, uncomfortable and difficult, because everybody is talking about the minorities in the Middle East and the plight of the minorities. And not many people, especially in the West, know exactly how the situation came to where we are today. One thing everybody says, which is absolutely true, but that doesn't stop us, or shouldn't stop us, from searching and knowing more, which is the fact that it is not an easy subject. Once you speak about the minorities in the Middle East, you are entering into a minefield, right? And the more you unpack such a complicated subject, the more you think you are going deeper in the troubles of the Middle East and the discomfort of everything happened for centuries. Imagine, we're talking about centuries. The Ottoman Empire alone lasted over 500 years in the Middle East. So however you look at the subject, it is uncomfortable. So when I chose the topic, I have to admit to you that I didn't expect it to be that thorny and that difficult. So bear with me, and even if you felt uncomfortable in any part of it, we will discuss it. I'm not asking any one of you to agree with me on everything. And also, all what I'm doing is an attempt to unfold a very difficult and complicated issue and make it as simple, no, it's not simple in the sense of simplistic, but as understandable as possible, because I know in the West people always complain about how complicated the subject of the Middle East. So, just to let you know what you are entering now. So the Middle East, actually, what I mean by the Middle East, I mean the Levant. Are you familiar with the phrase? Or the Near East used to be called also, as it used to be called. Actually, I'm the graduate of the Near East School of Theology. So it's not the Middle East. Sometimes the concept of Middle East is too wide, including Iran and Egypt and even North Africa and all this. So what I mean is the Near East or the Levant. It is the most, or one of the most, if not the most, racially and religiously diverse area in the whole world. According to recent geopolitical research by a researcher I respect, his name is Nabil Khalifa, he says that there are, according to his research, 59 religious minorities in the Middle East and the Levant. The reason for this incredibly high number is that this is the birthplace of the three major monotheistic religions. And many other religious groups came into existence as these three faith groups developed. So there are other faith groups attached to those three monotheistic religions, came after, throughout history. In addition to that, we still have in the Middle East ancient religions, that they are not monotheistic necessarily. And there are some monotheistic religions very ancient, like we still have in Iraq Zoroastrians. You know that. The Yazidis are older than Christianity. And the Shabak, have you heard of the Shabak? So I'm sure we have heard a lot of those groups in the recent years. Before that, they were invisible in the Middle East. Actually, Christians were invisible for the Westerns, let alone ancient religions. So the location of the Middle East, the geopolitical location in the Middle East, as a stepping stone to Europe and Africa and Asia, has brought people from all around the world. Merchants, missionaries, conquerors, you name it. So it was a place where so much traffic of culture and trade and war and kingdoms rising, kingdoms falling, all in this area of the world. Dr. Charles Malik, I don't know if you heard of Dr. Charles Malik, says, very interesting, he says, he's a Lebanese thinker and philosopher. He believed that no majority in the Middle East could eliminate, absorb, or eradicate the minorities in the Middle East due to the stubborn resilience of those minorities to any attempt to assimilate them and to the constant influx and outflow of cultures in the region. So, and he continues, he's a wonderful philosopher, and say, I'm paraphrasing here in how I understood Charles Malik. He says, well, don't forget there is an element of God in that. If you don't believe in God, go to the Middle East. You would see the work of God there, that those minorities survived. This diversity has been both a curse and a blessing throughout the history of the Middle East. Many empires faced the challenge of the myriad minorities of the Middle East. Like, for example, we have the Babylonians, the Persians, the Hittite, the Macedonians, the Romans, the Byzantines, and later the Muslims, the Turks, and eventually even the French and the British. All these are examples of all these conquerors and kingdoms that rose and fell in the Middle East. Throughout this time, the minorities did not live at the margins of society. On the contrary, actually, they played a major role in every civilization that came to the Middle East. Don't forget that the minorities in the Middle East were not created through immigration like Europe. This is a very important point that differentiates the minorities in the Middle East. They look, they dress, they speak, and they behave the same way as the majority. Because they are one people, actually. Here you see somebody from the way they speak, the way they dress, what they eat, somehow you feel they are immigrants. And you know they are part of a minority. In the Middle East, you can't. Even in my name, when I lived in Lebanon during the war, every checkpoint was interested to know your religion. That's normal in Lebanon. Sorry, Zalfa, but this is normal, especially in 17 years of war. So when I lived in Beirut, we used to anticipate what the next checkpoint would be. I used to have 5 IDs, and I needed to pick the right ID. Otherwise, it's life-threatening. It was really, really, really life-threatening. So, and the checkpoint, the first thing the checkpoint did was to know your religion. Say, your name, Nadim. Your family name, Nassar. He couldn't understand. My name and my family name say nothing about my religion. I'm not Michael, nor George, nor Ilyas, nor anything. So, your father's name, Jad. Another Arabic name. Your mother's name, Malaka. And they, on the checkpoint, they become more, irritated. So tell me something to tell me what religion you are. But of course, I enjoyed this. I really enjoyed it. That let them guess what, because my religion is irrelevant. So this is very, very important for the Western people to understand that the minorities in the Middle East are not immigrants. So the minorities have always belonged to the very fabric of the society. And they can be found in all professions, all trades, in all cultural, social, and political movements. They were inside all the movements, whatever they were. They did not form ghettos. Although, some quarters in some cities and big cities and ancient cities in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine and Iraq, you see a Christian quarter, but it's not a ghetto, it's just more of that minority there. As an example, when the Frankish and German crusaders invaded the region, the minorities did not welcome them as Christian liberators. So I always remind the Muslims when they host me on Islamic TV or radio, and it happens all the time. And I say, you need to remember that the Christians and the other minorities in the Middle East, we never welcomed and felt that the Crusaders were Christian liberators and let's work with them. Didn't happen. And they stood alongside their Muslim neighbors against the invaders. When the Ottomans conquered the Middle East and oppressed the whole region for more than 500 years, the minorities played the same role, standing alongside the majority against the outsiders. I'm saying majority here because the majority in Iraq is different than Syria, is different than Lebanon. Because of that, I'm saying majority. I'm not naming it because it's different from place to place. And after the Ottomans, when the British and the French came to help us get rid of the Ottomans, but actually they stayed and they assumed the mandates of the area, we also, all the minorities, played a major role, and they were in the heart of the independence and revolutionary movements in those countries. As the independence briefly flourished in the 40s, around the 40s, 50s, Christians, Druze, Kurds, whatever, just examples, held prominent places in the new nationalist movements and governments, like prime ministers. Do you know that Syria had a Christian prime minister? Faris al-Khoury. 5 defense ministers in أهلا سيدنا تفضل. 5 defense ministers, سيدنا تفضل 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 تفضل. 5 defense ministers were Druze in the history of Syria. So they were there in the independent movements. In the modern age, the minorities in the Middle East have worked to encourage the formulation of a Middle Eastern identity, a political and racial identity free from religious influence and based instead on Arab nationalism. That started the Pan-Arabism. Have you heard of the concept Pan-Arabism? That the leader of that movement was the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'ath Party was established by 2 Christians. And then the Ba'ath Party split. Part of the Ba'ath Party went to Iraq, and part of the Ba'ath Party stayed in Syria. So, originally, 2 Christians established it. Please do not imagine for a minute that what I have told you so far, that this is a tale of millennia of perfectly happy coexistence. No. Actually, over the centuries, there have been periods of persecution of the minorities, or at the very least, discrimination against them. But these have had their roots in regional, national, and international politics. So, every time the minorities were persecuted in the Middle East, some external fingers and hands were playing behind the scenes. A man would not take up a sword or a gun against his neighbor just because they were different religions or cultural groupings. Each time, this has been the result of civic or religious leaders, mostly influenced by external powers, stirring the people up against particular minority for ulterior political motives. A frequent element of this has been to exploit one group's ignorance of the other, so that the minority could be ascribed terrible, sinful, and quite imaginary practices designed to turn the majority against them. And this, the best example we have is when the Yazidis were kicked out of Syria by the Ottomans. You know what was based on the discrimination? Was totally wrong misconceptions about what the Yazidis believed. So it was ignorance about about their beliefs and rumors. So it's easy to at that time to spread rumors and find ways to turn the majority against a minority based on totally false accusations. This persecution does not always come in violent forms. It's not always, killing and slaughtering. Sometimes it happens indirectly. It's subtle persecution, and it was achieved through unfair and restrictive laws and regulations drafted to make the minorities suffer, denying them advancement, restricting their rights, and encouraging them to leave. There are a lot of Ottoman laws that churches were not allowed to build a kitchen in the church. If your toilet was broken, you couldn't repair it. And such laws are still in place in Egypt. In Egypt, even today. if they want to take the laws as they are, no church would be built and no church would be repaired if anything goes wrong in Egypt, in any church in Egypt. One element I must highlight is that there is historically a lack of fellowship between the minorities. This is another problem. The minorities themselves were not in harmony with each other. And especially, and as a Christian, I say, between the Christian denominations. The ecumenical relations in the Middle East, I'm not very proud of how the Christians handled their own relationships with each other. I will take the Christians as an example. The Christians' position in the Middle Eastern society has been weakened by rivalry between the different denominations. And denominations were and are very worried about people leaving their church to join another church. You know this rivalry? You're leaving the Orthodox Church to join the Protestant Church, or the Catholic Church to join the Orthodox Church, and all this. There is a suspicion that every other priest wants to steal the congregation of the other. Steal. This is what we call in Arabic. As a result, the unity was very, very damaged between the Christians. And even marriage, interdenominational marriage, was actively discouraged. My mother and my father were an exception. Mom is Orthodox, and my father was Presbyterian. The combination is lethal in Syria, I tell you. Because the Orthodox believe that the Presbyterians have not even the right to exist. And they say to us, you were all Orthodox. What are you? Come back to the mother church. This is the mentality. So, why is that? Because not all the Christian denominations in the Middle East, they don't all belong to the Middle East originally. From the 19th century onwards, Western missionaries arrived to set up churches, like the Anglican Church. We call it in Arabic the Episcopalian Church, Al-Usqufiyya. The Presbyterian Church, Al-Mashaykhiyya. The Lutheran, Al-Lutheriyya. So all these churches, now they exist in the Middle East. Actually, they don't originate from the Middle East. They are planted in the Middle East. And with them came foreign music, architecture, what else? Tradition, and even theology. I studied Western theology in the Near East School of Theology for 7 years. I studied Western theology. Very little Eastern theology I studied there. There is a lot of ignorance between the denominations, and this hurts Christianity greatly. For instance, very few Protestants would truly know what the Orthodox Church believes about icons. When you say the word icon to a Protestant, they would have rash. They would look at the icon and say, oh, this is for them. Them means the Orthodox. And once you say Protestant to an Orthodox, they would say they don't believe in Mary. So the accusations are ready, but they do not, these accusations are not based in any way on true knowledge of the other. Sadly, the splintered church in the Middle East added to its own problems, increasing the suffering of its people by not living in harmony within itself, but rather obsessing with territorial thinking and fear of the other. Friends, who knows? that could have been achieved if the minorities were more together, or if the minorities of the Middle East banded together to support each other and to present a common front. In this way, they could have worked with the majority in a much better way for the benefit of everyone in the Middle East. This has not happened. In Lebanon, for example, during the civil war, there were many of indigenous minorities joined fighting with militias. There were the Christian militias, the Sunni militias, the Druze militias, the Shia militias. Every religious group in Lebanon, they had their own militias. Militias, it means they were engaged in fighting, establishing their own fighting groups. What was the justification for that? What do you think if you ask a Christian, why are you in a Christian militia? What would you think that they would answer? They would have answered. We are defending our existence. That was the justification. I never believed it. But I lived in Lebanon for 7 years, and I saw it with my own eyes. I saw posters of Christ and Mary on tanks. I saw priests sprinkling tanks with holy water in Lebanon. And that means, to defend your existence, it means you need to slaughter others. And Christians did. Although this was often clearly against their own principles and their own beliefs. Nobody could say in Lebanon that in the name of Christ they were fighting, but they could say for the existence of Christians. الوجود المسيح. Since the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, when the French and the British divided the Middle East, we should thank them wholeheartedly for that, the region has not seen any kind of political, racial, or religious stability. It added to the hell of the Middle East. One unfortunate byproduct of how Britain and France divided the massive corpse of the Ottoman Empire was that they did so with no regard to the cultural and religious identities of the people who lived there. They couldn't care less what kind of makeup the society had. They just divided the area. So, what did they do? They created Syria with a majority of Sunni. They created Lebanon with a majority of Christians. Not any longer. They created Iraq with a majority of Shia. They created Jordan with a majority of Sunni, but in Jordan, the majority of the Jordanians are actually what? Palestinians. So, look at this fantastic mosaic in the Middle East. It's a recipe for disaster. Within each of the new countries of the Middle East, independence proved to be neither peaceful nor stable. The stability of the region after the independence of all these countries were very shaky. Do you know how many coups, military coups, Syria alone produced in a decade? 10 coups. All what they did in Syria in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, is one would kick the other out through a military coup. What stability could that be? So, and to add to all this, the establishment of Israel in 1948 added to the region's difficulties, making them even more complex. At this point, of course, Palestine ceased to exist as a recognized and independent country. Altogether, the country disappeared. Sadly, within 20 years of gaining independence, one religion or denomination had taken total power in every one of the remaining Arab states in the Middle East. In Syria and Iraq, the majority now found themselves ruled by the minorities. So, what happened? The irony, it's unbelievable. Nothing like this would happen in the whole world. The irony is, the same Ba'ath party in Iraq was led by Saddam Hussein, by then Saddam, but by the Sunni oppressing the Shia. And the Sunni were what? A minority. In Syria, the Alawites rose to the power. Also in Ba'ath party, the same party. One led by the Sunni minority to oppress the Shia majority, and one led by the Shia link minority, the Alawites, linked to the Shia groups, oppressing the Sunni majority. Are you lost or not yet? So, I hope not, because it's very dynamic. In both Iraq and Syria, the minorities ruled through kind of dictatorship, unfortunately, in order to keep the power for themselves. In Syria, the Alawites, and in Iraq, the Sunni, and both are minorities. Peculiarly, the Ba'ath party survived in both and ruled for decades. This situation lasted for more than 4 or 5 decades, until the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003 and the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011. The decades of oppression by the ruling minorities in each of the countries has fostered a hatred and a longing to revenge. Now, some people may feel very uncomfortable. So, certainly in Syria, this problem goes even deeper, because the Alawites had previously been oppressed by the Sunnis. So, for centuries, before they themselves gained the power, this creates a huge problem in both Syria and Iraq, as a vicious circle of oppression and revenge has developed. And the minority has taken full part in this. In the Middle East, of course, the Middle East does not exist in vacuum, my friends. External powers are taking full advantage of the imbalance of power in the Middle East to further their interests or to promote political or religious ideologies. Today, what do we have today? Today there are even greater challenges, new and dangerous forces that are threatening both the majorities and the minorities. As a result, the whole region is in danger of slipping ever deeper into chaos. Perhaps this may force the minorities and majorities to break this cycle of vengeance and to work together to form a new Middle East that respects the identities of all the component peoples that make this region such a wonderful and unique place. The people of the Middle East, my friends, are facing a unique challenge in the 21st century. As so-called the Islamic State, or ISIS, or IS, you choose, works to destroy anything and anyone remotely different from themselves. This terrorist organization threatens the existence of the minorities and threatens the identities of the majorities. Because both majorities, Shia and Sunni, have to stop and think about what they believe and about their differences. What good can come out of the abyss of the IS or ISIS? I tell you what good could come if we would be wise enough to stop and think. To overcome the almost overwhelming darkness of ISIS, Sunni and Shia Muslims, the majorities, must now consider their true identities and followers of Islam, as followers of Islam, and find ways to live with and even celebrate their differences. No other choice. The challenge of ISIS is also to test how will the majorities respond to the plight of the minorities. If they really want the minorities to stay as integral parts of the fabric of the Middle East and as partners in the one homeland, then they must show this through action. The majority needs to protect the minority. The ISIS challenge, however, to the minorities is firstly to be resilient. We have all the minorities in the Middle East. We need to be resilient where it is humanly possible by not abandoning the Middle East. And secondly, to show solidarity with each other and with the majority. And the majorities need to see that the minorities are fully committed to the region and to a great partnership for the future. The minorities are responding to this challenge, and we have seen firsthand in Syria and in Lebanon just how determined the Christians and other minorities, such as the Druze and the Yazidis and others, to stay in the Middle East for the Middle East. The only way for the majorities and the minorities to live together in the Middle East and flourish there in the future is to create a system that does not give superiority to any religious group over the other. Despite the fact that Islam in particular has a political agenda and that presents a true Middle Eastern citizenship to which all people can subscribe. It's the concept of citizenship that all people of the Middle East, majorities and minorities, have to subscribe to. What we need is truly secular society, not in the anti-religious style of Europe. This is not what I mean. But where religion and state live side by side, complementing each other, and where the laws of the land are civic rather than religious. Having said that, any system should emerge indigenously, so from the indigenous people, from the country itself, not imposed by some powers from outside, respecting the makeup, the tradition, the history, and the society with all its components, so that the system works in the service of the society rather than the other way around. We should not serve the system should serve the society. In this way, we can expect a new and flourishing Middle East. Thank you.